lips, sparks fly from her fingertips.
Hello everyone, my name is Franek.
I'm Julia.
And I'm Lucia.
And today, for our fourth episode, we will be talking about folk horror movies from the 60s and the 70s from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And specifically, some Slavic films are gonna be interrogated, questioned, pondered on. And this episode is subsequent to our previous episode on witches and witchcraft in the context of the Netherlands. But since the three of us are from Eastern Europe, me and Julia being from Poland and Lucia being from Slovakia, we were also interested in how it is depicted coming from our countries, as we are embedded in this kind of folklore. So that's why we started investigating the folk horror films from that region. And I think this is especially an interesting time period because some of the countries I think all of the countries do not exist anymore.
That's
yeah.
true,
Yeah, we have Yugoslavia, Czechoslovak, and yeah.
Oh, whoa. I didn't even think
And
about
Soviet
that.
Union,
actually.
yeah. And I think
And
that's
Soviet
another
Union, yeah.
interesting theme that connects all of these films, because I think what we can start arguing later is these films kind of fight with the repression in a subversive way.
Yeah, because two of them at least are one of its kind almost. Leptirica is the first horror film in Yugoslavia, and Viy is the first horror film, or one of the first in the Soviet Union. So that's interesting as to also look at why not more horror films of that kind of aesthetic were made during that time.
Yeah, I was also investigating the folk horror's origins, and there are these two scholars who are very much embedded in the context of Great Britain, but it's Robert Edgar and Wayne Johnson, and they created this Routledge companion to folk horror, and they basically argue there that the origin of the folk horror genre was a response to the modernity of the late 19th century of Great Britain, and I think this could be also intertwined to what we're talking about, that I think, through the folk horror genre, these directors tried to respond in some way to what was going on and to the systems that they were living in. So maybe, for the context, we watched Viy, which is a Soviet film from 1967, the first horror movie of its kind. We watched Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, and it's a 1970 Czechoslovak horror film. We watched Leptirica, which is a Yugoslavian film from 1973.
I found it pretty interesting, mainly in the portrayal of women, because as we were discussing the films that we watched, we found the common path of womanhood, sexuality, body that is trapped inside this witch taboo, not taboo, but maybe image, yeah, the repressed image of a witch that is also disappearing with these movies, I think. And now is also what we were discussing in the last episode with our guests, that the witches are coming back, but for the longest time they have been repressed and disappeared.
Interestingly, the director of Nosferatu, Robert Eggers, when he was including films that he used as a source of inspiration for Nosferatu, he included Leptirica.
Oh.
So these movies are also making a comeback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, specifically with Eggers and his movie Witch that we discussed in the previous episode, I think, the folk and the horror, it's coming back.
It's coming back. Whether you like it or not, the witches are coming back. So maybe let's start with Viy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to introduce it?
Sure. So Viy is a 1967 Soviet film, and it follows the students of Kiev Seminary, especially one Koma, who meets a witch. He gets terrified and he beats her very violently, and she turns into a beautiful woman that later on dies. And he's forced to spend 3 nights with the coffin inside the chapel and pray for the souls.
Well, yes.
For the soul, yeah.
Thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Oh my god.
My thoughts are that I hated that guy. I hated that guy. I hated Koma.
But I think it's gonna be an theme, like with all of these movies.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the guys were always horrible.
Yeah. I was actually listening to another podcast before this, and it was talking about V and about how this could be seen as an example of a female rage movie, or even before the female rage genre got popular in a sense, because like essentially the guy is to blame for everything.
Yeah.
Like he's a dickhead, and everybody, even before this old lady turns into a beautiful woman, everybody, I feel like, or at least me, was rooting for her already. Like when the guy was used as a broom, I was like, yes, this is how it should be.
I think that's a theme, that we have this contrast between woman who is spiritual and man who is supposed to be the voice of reason.
Yeah, but then I feel like these movies also lament the loss of spirituality overall. Yeah, with V, he's a missionary apprentice in this monastery. And I feel like in the beginning, when they are so eager for the school recess, they are apprentices, but they disavow religion at the same
They
time.
don't give a fuck.
Yeah, they really don't.
Yeah.
And even Koma, when he's supposed to later be in this church and pray for 3 nights in a row, he's drunk all the time.
There's
Oh,
so
right,
much
yes.
drinking.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
so much
Holy
drinking,
shit.
and he really doesn't give a shit
Yeah.
about his religion. And I feel like this witch, she is a wake-up call to the spirituality and kind of tries to shame that guy for not giving a shit. And I think there is this very similar nudge to that in Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, because yeah, this movie is highly critical of church as an institution. We have a rape scene that is performed by a priest. Then later he wants to burn Valerie at the stake because she was luring him carnally into no good. So once again,
All priests say that.
yeah. So I feel you have this criticism of the way spirituality takes form in the contemporary times, because Valerie is the only one who is closely linked to her spirituality. Because I feel like in Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, there's either people who fall too much into the spirituality or are too removed from spirituality, as represented by the priest, while Valerie's grandmother, who later neglects everything in order to become vampire, gives in completely to this spiritual realm, while I think Valerie is trying to balance it in between. And I feel like this has something to say with the system at the time, where you try to navigate your own personal self while at the same time perform under the system that constantly invigilates you and monitors every single move that you make. So maybe it's about preserving the self.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And also, I think that women find comfort and safety and their own identity within women communities and within themselves as women, exploring their womanhood, their sexuality, their bodies. You see a lot of naked women bodies in these movies. I don't know if you guys remember anything in particular.
I mean, in each of these movies, a woman was a fetishized subject.
Yes, yeah.
In Leptirica also, she was the desired object, the daughter of a landowner, and she's in love with this poor villager who wants to marry her, but he's not rich enough for her father. The female subject there is constantly treated sexually, and the biggest achievement this guy can have when he's talking with his pals is that he's basically gonna deflower her, quote unquote. And in Leptirica, spoiler alert, as in all the other movies we saw, the woman rebels, and towards the end it is the woman who turns to be a vampire and basically haunts the man and ultimately kills him. Interestingly, in that final scene, the woman takes the man to the grave of Sava Savanovic. Savanovic is a predecessor of Dracula.
Wow.
Is the most famous Yugoslavian vampire, and he was already in the Balkan folklore before Dracula. But basically, the main character, her name is Radojka, in her vampire self takes Strahinia, her soon-to-be husband, to the grave of Sava Savanovic and ultimately kills Strahinia. So here you can see that towards the end, Radojka, the female subject, is giving herself to her darkest desires, I guess, and gains independency from the man.
Yeah. I feel like double identity is something that is also present in all of the films. Like in V, you have the old witch and then the young witch. Then in Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, there's the Valerie kind of innocent, like pre-menstrual girl. And then this Week of Wonders that she's experiencing is going on during her first week of menstruation ever. And she doesn't change, but the world around her changes. And that's when she starts exploring her own womanhood. So in that sense, this could also be seen as an exploration of a different identity she didn't know before, or she didn't know she had before. And then at the end, she retreats into her small little room that is all white. And that happens after this week is finished. So in a sense, it's also these witches or these women, they shift from person to person, and in that sense they're way more fluid and they're way more not volatile but more open characters than the men who are just rude as hell
and stay the same throughout the film.
Exactly.
Right?
Koma in V was drunk all the time. I was surprised by how many scenes of him and the other men drinking there actually were. I think that section made up a big part of the movie, and those sections, to be honest, to me weren't so interesting because I'm like, why the hell would you put this here? And then in Valerie, you had the polecat, you had the constable, which I think was the same person.
And the father.
The father,
Yeah.
which I also think was the same
Yeah.
person. And then you had that other guy, Eaglet,
yeah.
who was also like, I didn't know if he's good or bad. But then he was her brother, and then he wasn't her brother.
But I think that's the main thing about this film, that it's about this moment when a girl realizes that everybody around her begins to perceive her as a sexual
Yeah.
object.
Even her father, even her
Em-
brother.
Yeah, like everyone starts to see her not as a child anymore, but as as an object, as something that can be used. And it's about this transgression that starts at this age of 13, 14 years old. So yeah, that's why this movie is very often criticized as being quote-unquote a pedophile's dream, while I feel like this is exactly what this film criticizes. There's no room for children to explore and experience coming into being this sexual self, because already there's so many sexual impositions done from the outside that Valerie cannot do that herself, because there are so many identities that people lock her up in, and she has no room to see what that is for herself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely does make sense. And I think you guys were particularly talking about interpreting movies later after they are released, and how we look at the context that they were made in. So maybe we should also talk about this now.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to come at an old movie with you being you, with the information that you have right now, with all, especially coming from an academic background where we're constantly fed all these theories. We constantly read the same theories over and over again, theories that are popular at the moment. And in that sense, that kind of limits our critical thinking by putting us into a bubble. And this is not going to be a rant about academia right now, but I'm just saying that to me it sort of connects, because me as a person that is fed by the institution, I am more than programmed to go into films, old films like these, and look at it with all the information that I'm being fed right now. But that's the problem, because we should not be doing this, because films are produced in a specific context. Of course, there could have been, let's say, less nudity, even though I read that it was supposedly done in a friendly manner with the actor Valerie.
Yeah, to specify, the main criticism is that the actress, she was like 13, 14 when the film was being recorded, and there are scenes that she is nude, and there are also explicitly erotic scenes. And do I think that the movie like this should be made today? No, I don't think so, because this would be inherently problematic, and I disagree with attempting to do something like this today. But knowing the context of films being still fledgling in that aspect, that it was the new wave period, so people were like experimenting a lot with what can be shown in the film and what can be not. Also, I watched an interview with the actress that was recorded in 2006, and she there explicitly states that she remembers very fondly the entire process of making that film, and that her mom was present the entire time, controlling if everything is okay. So I think for that time period, it sounds like that there were taken certain measures. But I still feel like the movie makes a certain statement about how we as adults perceive children. I think it's also important to remember that a 13-year-old, 14-year-old person, while still being a child, begins to explore these sexual awakenings, quote unquote. But it's the fact that this is also the period when we start to impose these sexual images on children that is problematic.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also interesting how normalized it is in a sense. Again, going back to the topic of men, I feel that in a sense it's normalized. The film shows that it is men who have these fantasies about young women. And in that sense, nobody was questioning that in the film. Everybody was just like, oh, okay, cool. This is happening, I guess.
But then I think the important point is that it's not only men. Because, for example, grandmother is also perceiving her as a sexual object, but from kind of a different perspective, from the perspective of jealousy and wanting to be young again.
Yeah.
So I think, it is about the body as a commodity, especially the young body of a child as a commodity, and the different ways of how people approach it.
Yeah, that's true. The grandmother was really crazy.
Jealous.
She was really jealous.
Yeah.
And then she also sucked the blood of Hedvika, not only Valerie.
Yeah. Hedvika is Valerie's neighbor who was forced to marry an older guy. And Valerie also observes that relationship, if you can call it, this marriage, the consummation of that marriage as well. Hedvika is her age or a little older than her. I think that also strikes Valerie to think the innocence of Hedvika taken by an older man, and having this realization that, oh, it can be me, it maybe will be me soon. Because I'm growing up, because I'm seen as a potential wife, as a reproduction tool as well.
I mean, also, the only kind of intimate relationship that we saw in the film was between Valerie and Hedvika, right? There was this scene where they were kissing in bed together. And that to me seemed like the most genuine moment of the whole film.
Wasn't that the moment that Hedvika was also kind of set free, quote unquote?
Yeah.
We could move on to the theme of rurality, because that's another thread that holds these movies together. The fact that all of them are happening in rural areas. I just found this scholar, his name is Adam Scoville, and he's considered to be the authority in terms of the folk horror genre. And he wrote this book, Folk Horror, Hours Dreadful and Things Strange. And he's discussing there the concept of rurality from the global aspect, because he's mainly focusing on the British horror. But then in terms of rurality, this is where he talks about how, because also rurality being reminiscent of Periphery, this could be fitting to discuss movies from outside the British-centric viewpoint. And he discusses rurality, I'm quoting, as a concept on a wider global scale, partly because it widens the field of interest towards how folk horror essentially works, but also because so many examples from all around the world tap into their own form of rurality, where folklore, history, agricultural customs, and landscape conspire to tip reality sideways.
Wow.
And when reading that, I was like, hell yeah, like this is exactly what the movies that we watch do. Viy, Leptirica, and Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, all of them take place in a secluded village that is far away from the city and is surrounded either by fields or forests or mountains, to an extent that it becomes claustrophobic even. There is this contradiction of a vast area becoming kind of claustrophobic and intimidating. And actually, in this chapter, Koval discusses Viy and also another Czechoslovakian film, Morgiana, that we were talking about.
Oh yeah, I watched
Yeah.
Morgana. I didn't really find super tight connections with the theme of witches, but in terms of women revenge and in terms of setting of good sister, bad sister, fighting against each other, good versus evil, that's definitely the theme. And it was pretty cool to see another angle of female relationships being explored. But maybe, Franek, if you wanna continue.
Yeah, like he just talks all of these films. Leptirica is not talked about here, but Viy, Morgiana, the Valerie and her Week of Wonders, he discusses how these films, I'm quoting, showcase varied and haphazard relationships with the magical, the rural, and the supernatural, with these films mixing their respective countries' historicism with fears of many isolated magical communities. And he fleshes out further Valerie and her Week of Wonders, talking about how rurality is the most important concept in terms of Valerie embracing the sexual that rurality offers, that at the same time merges with the world of rituals and demons. I think the interesting takeaway of what Koval is arguing is that rurality is providing a certain erotic aspect that can liberate or confine, that also at the same time I feel like is inherent to the Eastern European region.
I mean, within the political context of all these films, socialism, for one, was against the church. Religion did not exist and was not supposed to exist. They were trying to move people out of the villages into the cities so that they could work more. So in this sense, if you read it that way, the village functions as a marker of the time, almost, you know? Also in terms of this over-sexualization. Rational people aren't supposed to think about sexuality. Rational people are supposed to work. They need to...
And keep the sexuality to themselves.
Exactly. Sexuality is not a spoken topic in Eastern Europe or anywhere for that matter in that time. But also, if we're going to talk about rural stereotypes, let's say the image of the maiden is also very much something that is confined to the village. This kind of lady with a flowy white skirt hanging up the fucking laundry or something like this on a clothesline.
Being spied on by a local guy.
Exactly. Local old man getting drunk.
This is what connects, for example, Viy and Leptirica, that both of these movies are an hour long and the most action happens towards the end.
Oh, yeah.
And the first 50-something minutes is just a bunch of men roaming around, being superstitious and trying to achieve something, and they achieve literally nothing.
Yeah.
And I think that this is interesting that completely different contexts, Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, draw on the same archetypes of the masculine villagers, revealing certain irony in their approach towards trying to achieve something. And then, yeah, this is like where the comedy comes from.
Yeah.
In movies at the time, villagers were very much seen as a tool for comedy. Like, oh, let's Charlie Chaplin-esque sort of like, haha, what are the villagers gonna do? They're gonna trip over their oar or something like this, you know?
But that's what makes them likable, I guess, in that context, in the contemporary context, because now when we watch this, we're annoyed by them, especially that we see how it reinforces the patriarchal structures. But I feel like at the time it could provide certain comedic relief, because with the context, for example, of Leptirica, what I find interesting is that nowadays you would not consider this movie scary at all. And at the time, it was the only horror film made in Yugoslavia. And there were gossips that people were dying of a heart attack seeing it. And to this day, the older people from the former Yugoslavia think of this movie as the scariest film that they have seen in their youth. So that's also an interesting thing in terms of what do we consider scary and funny these days.
Yeah. I was also expecting Viy to be scarier, to be honest. I came into it thinking that it's a horror film, but you only see a girl flying around surfing in a coffin And
But the special effects there, incredible.
so good. Yes.
Yeah.
For the time,
So
period.
good.
People crawling out of the walls, I was impressed.
Yes, that last
That
scene
was
was
very
so
nice.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think both of these movies, Leptirica and Viy, people should watch it for the final scenes.
Yeah.
Like the whole atmosphere and vibe accumulates in these final scenes.
Maybe scariness just wasn't a thing in that time. People didn't want to watch scary movies because why would people want to feel fear, you know? When
When they
especially,
already
like-
were feeling fear in their real lives.
Exactly. And especially when it's supposed to be a form of entertainment, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also a matter of who was watching these films at
Yeah.
the time. Like, it was obviously not intended for the comas and, other...
The comas of the
the
world.
comas of the world. And it was made for people who had access to this kind of entertainment as well.
Do we know if it was propaganda?
I feel like horror film, because of its genre, was precisely liberating the necessity for propaganda.
But at the same time, it painted those villagers in such a bad state that I was like, it felt somewhat like propaganda-y to me, in the sense of like...
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's also 19th century, right? It shows the pre-1917 revolution villages.
Yeah, like the imperialist.
Yeah, because it's based on Gogol's short
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, that's true. So in that sense, the whole movie could be a ridicule of that point in time. And I now want to know if it was ever banned or not.
Yeah, I don't think it was banned.
I want to know if Stalin liked Viy. No, Stalin was dead at that time already.
Yeah.
Who was
Whether
the-
he would have liked it.
Stalin would have definitely loved
New
it.
essay idea.
Why would Stalin love Viy? A list of reasons.
Oh my god.
Yeah, on the Wikipedia page you have reception, but obviously you only have the modern critics' Western reception.
What do they say?
I mean, this movie is considered to be a classic and a sign of the times, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think the film is important for its final special effects. But I do feel like the potential of the horror genre is the fact that this could be a way to make something political that at the same time is apolitical. Or just going against the propaganda checklists that were at the time. Because it's so far removed from reality, I think this is why we don't have many of these films.
Yeah. It's just that somehow every time I see a film that goes against the church produced at that time, I'm like, it's propaganda.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, it was very much anti-religion, the whole
Yeah.
system. But then I wonder to what extent these films are anti-religion and to what extent they are anti-institution and they
Yeah.
precisely call for the return to spirituality.
Yeah.
But I feel like they criticize the way spirituality is understood and institutionalized.
I mean, knowing who made Valerie and the team behind it, I don't believe that is a propaganda film.
Yeah.
And also because of the whole Czechoslovak new wave and stuff. But yeah, but just with Viy, I just wasn't sure, to be honest.
I mean, these films are deeply spiritual.
Yeah.
And the message is that there are stronger powers than human. And they win. In all of these movies, the non-human wins. The spiritual wins.
True. Honestly, if you change that aspect of spirituality with something else, like nature, like in the case of Olga Tokarczuk books or something like that, it's the same concept, kind
Yeah.
of.
Yeah. Should we wrap up?
Yeah.
I think so. All right. We will leave all of the information of these movies in the description. And you can listen to the previous episode with our guests on all of the streaming platforms. You can also give us a follow, give us a comment, share your thoughts on witches. And also, please follow us on social media because we're sharing some interesting information about future episodes. And the next one will be on Flick's best poetry. if you have something that you want to share, we will leave our email address and you can shoot us an email.
I know people in Amsterdam love Flixbus.
Yeah.
Everybody loves Flixbus.
Everybody loves Flixbus until they don't. So, thank you for listening and bye.
Bye!
See how